Adachi.
Adachi! Adachi!
Tohru Adachi is unfortunately one of the least well-kept secrets online, but gratefully whenever I played the original Persona 4 on PS2, somehow coming fresh off the series from P5 and avoiding any sort of community or fan discussion, I managed to avoid any spoilers as to his true identity in my own playthrough. Tohru Adachi is a really interesting character, partially for how much of an everyman he is, but having a somewhat pathetic everyman take a twist villain route is actually something that I have come to commend as a decision over more traditional high-stakes villains, as it offers a bit more of a look into a toxic, but not too uncommon mindset. Before we get to that, though, let's meet Adachi. Adachi is first introduced as,
I'm Adachi, the guy who's been your dad's slave since spring.
A bumbling rookie detective thrown out into Inaba because, as we later learn, is due to an unnamed mistake made on the task force elsewhere. The idea that the PD are often light in rural areas, as many more people live and aim to serve in cities, more action, more things to occupy yourself with, more modern-day conveniences. Being sent to the boonies can be seen as a demotion, or a punishment, and for Adachi, who is fresh into the career, making a mistake so early, it's hard to say how long he would be sent to rest out there. You sometimes see this with US military too. They may be stationed for training or in squads in certain areas, but if there's a disagreement between two parties within a squad, it's not uncommon to see one of the parties split from the group and be reassigned elsewhere. We assume that the mistake Adachi made is to some extent of bumbling or laziness, something driven home later, but Adachi does seem like a genuinely caring guy, at least off the bat. Whether due to obligation and in service of keeping appearances, or genuine, he helps take care of Dojima when they get drunk and generally puts up with any smack talk he receives, or chewing out that comes his way. He's pretty loose-lipped throughout the game, constantly leaking information to the investigation team under the guise of an accident, at one time even being sent on the trail of the investigation team by Dojima, being caught immediately. He uses this unassuming incompetence to his advantage, though, like catching an obviously incorrect suspect for spying on Rise, pretending that it was the solution to the case and there was nothing to worry about. In reality, it was a diversion to give Namatame his proper shot. Adachi manages to weasel in and out of the story pretty constantly in original Persona 4 and in Golden, with one often noted improvement being the addition of a social link, something that helps minimize any speculation that the player may have as who Adachi is, as one of the major portrait characters aside from Otani and Kashiwagi, to have one, but otherwise no social link. Due to Adachi's unique usage in the story, I'm going to talk about his social link and what it says about him prior to his arc in the story, then continue with his social link once it becomes relevant again in the dungeon section. Even though the player can start Adachi's social link as early as May 13th, following Yukiko's rescue, and his familiarization in the game makes sure to associate his involvement on the case by having him appear after Rise, Kwango Bongo, and Naoto's dungeon, with obvious reason for why Heaven and onwards wouldn't include him. The first link for Adachi starts immediately with bonding over them being from the city, something that I think makes Adachi feel more comfortable spreading the off-the-cuff feelings as you go on. He talks about how boring the job has been, finding lost cats, doing odd jobs, how whenever his suit gets dirty, the police won't even pay to get it cleaned. Japanese police force expectations and conduct isn't exactly my area of expertise, I'll be honest, and I doubt a couple days of researching would drastically improve my context for this comment, but I think the important takeaway here is to show that Adachi's disillusionment with the police force, and how he feels he isn't respected or given authority that he thought he would be, that he thought he would be revered just for his position, and he doesn't seem to be getting that. How he feels expendable, doing unimportant cat-catching quests. Even though there is a murder case, there is only so much stuff to inspect, and already so many people on it, it's hard to make headway with so many people and so little to go off of. He does some typical Adachi behavior, as I described earlier, as we see an old woman who Adachi hides from. The next link, you find Adachi eats a pretty unhealthy lifestyle, or generally that he doesn't take care of himself. He opens up to you about girls, going on about really kind of generic stuff like he likes cute girls. Wow, bucko, how scandalous. But more importantly, how over everything, how they look, if they're cute, he wants them to be a good cook. Knowing Adachi doesn't do a great job taking care of himself, the implication here is he wants a partner who will also be somewhat like a mother to him too. Where he doesn't manage, she can bring him up, which at its best is sweet. Given this context alone, there isn't really any sexist undertone to it, but given later characterization, this can be interpreted as him not just wanting a girl, but expecting the role of a woman to serve him, which is basically the opposite of sweet. The game sort of jokes on him for his comment about all they really need is to cook by reintroducing the old woman who has apparently already been inviting him over to feed him. While this is a joke, it's also meant to display Adachi's hypocrisy in him really expecting and wanting a lot more than he lets on, while pretending like he's not getting the bare minimum. I think back to a few periods in my life where I had been a while without a good relationship and thought, I don't want much, I just want a nice person who will listen to my interests and support me. But life is rarely actually that simple. As you get down to brass tacks, there's likely countless different variables that you are just automatically assuming will be there, when that's never an automatic assumption to make. When we make statements like that, there are a whole host of assumed traits and aspects that we bundle in without a second thought. In reality, almost no one who's honest with themselves actually only wants cooking ability in a partner. But this casual conversation and joke serves more than anything to drive home that despite being lonely and not caring for himself, Adachi often shelves his problems to the messed up state of society and of other people who don't really owe anything to him. He's not living in reality, unable to see why the life that he wants is actually far more nuanced than he presents, and he's not open to entering reality and facing the nuance associated with it, something that will come up as a major part of his character later on, and even in specific relation to women. After the old woman leaves, Adachi states a mixed bout of feelings about the situation. He feels annoyed, but insists that he might need to spend some time with her since it's a part of his job. Also, she might be lonely, due to having no relatives in town. Everything Adachi is saying about this old woman applies to himself. He sees his own loneliness in her, but it makes him annoyed because the person coming to his time of loneliness is a random old woman rather than someone more ideal in his personal view. Rank 3 takes place at night, reinforcing both parts of the previous two social links, that he takes poor care of himself and that he feels limited in this small town. Despite Adachi's complaints, he lies to the old woman about having dinner with you when the opportunity arises. This segues into rank 4, with dinner at your place for real. But before I go into that, the rest of this link gives a little bit more insight into Adachi before the workforce. He mentions his time at school as someone who focused mainly on getting good grades and studying. Considering his disillusionment with the system, so to speak, we can see the roots of that, being raised in a good school, getting good grades, and believing that the straight and narrow would lead him down the life that he always wanted, with the frustrating reality that life doesn't always give you what you put into it, even if you follow the straight and narrow, as he parrots. He admits that this sort of mindset only works in school, and you can see how it sort of crushes how he behaves in the quote-unquote real world. He hints at him having some more fun recently though, since there's something he's good at. As a blind, unspoiled player, you may assume that he's just trying to cheer himself up about some work on the police force, despite us knowing he's undervalued and kind of a slacker. But in retrospect, he's almost certainly talking about his ability in the TV and the freedom that it gives him in his life, where he feels he's lost that. This sort of morbid, obtuse way of referring to the actions is something recorded well in psychologically determined criminal narcissists. Criminals who, if they don't have suspect cast on them or feel they are getting away with their crimes too easily, they will vaguely find ways to brag about it in conversations, taking revel in the other person not having full context to who they are. I do want to state narcissism isn't inherently bad. Narcissists aren't immoral or untrustworthy, and they aren't bad people, just like any other sect of people. There are good and bad people who suffer from this disorder, and the way that they experience it is often different levels of extreme and even presents itself in different ways. But at this point, I think it's safe to say Adachi is written to fit in with the classically recorded criminal narcissist tropes. When Adachi leaves, he doesn't say that he's going home to make nimono after all. Instead, he says he's going to pick up some food, but from the conversation here and then in the previous link, I think they're trying to imply he actually has dinner with the old lady, which is kind of cute. I'm not entirely sure about that, although it does fit with the conventional storytelling and everything that we've heard so far, so I think it's at least worth mentioning. Rank 4, as I mentioned already, involves Nanako and is meant to endear us to Adachi as he tried to spend time with Nanako. He teases her about her pronunciation, but praises her correction. He accidentally mentions you leaving in the spring and then tries to cheer her up again as he does a magic trick, which is probably the most important part. Yu also uses a magic trick in the game to cheer up Nanako at one point, so this is meant to draw a parallel between Yu and Adachi as people. The praise that he receives from this instantly has him going for another trick and making him more comfortable joking around. It's clear that the praise makes him more comfortable. Rank 5 involves Adachi helping Nanako with her homework, where he teaches her some tricks to finishing all the work without doing any of it. Nanako is someone who loves learning and loves understanding things. She's naturally curious about the world around her and enjoys understanding it more. So this contrast to Adachi, who simply sees a task that needs finishing, a thing to be done, pointless red tape around the goal, as he states in his own job, it feeds back into the idea that Adachi lives in his own world, not engaging with everything that's offered, but instead taking the short paths as frequently as possible, and then retroactively complaining when he misses the scenery. Here, we also see the second appearance of the pink alligator story from Persona 3, the other being Kanji, as I covered in his segment. Unlike with Kanji, I can't see any super clear way that this story was meant to be applied here, so it very well may just rest as a reference. Like the pink alligator, Adachi is someone who feels alone, and due to his position in life, thrown into the boonies, both literally and figuratively, he is hungry, like the alligator. His Jester arcana even turns into hunger later on. In this metaphor, who is the bird, though? The old woman? I mean, people call old women old birds. You, the protagonist? Are you the bird that is meant to save him? Those are the people who reach out to him and connect. It can't be Mayumi Amano or Saki Konishi. They didn't want to do anything with him. So his victims don't match the bird, and the people matching the bird don't even become victims, i.e. get eaten in the story. There's also no sense of regret or sorrow for his actions, so it's hard to say, I think. Seeing Adachi as the bird makes even less sense, so I'm just gonna leave it there as a reference. I throw this explanation for non-inclusion in because it would be very easy for me to include this stuff about hunger and make a connection and voila, but that isn't analysis. You have no idea how many hours of research have gone into the shredder over the last 4 months of this project. And that's 4 months when I wrote the script, by the way. As of recording this audio, it's been almost a year. To try and give good faith, informative, and interesting, well-researched looks at this game, analysis isn't just tangential connections or long summaries with minor observations. It's a matter of understanding the cogs that run in the machine and explaining how they do it. It's looking at all the details and how they feed into each other, and a lot of times what you think might be feeding into it isn't. Even when your intuition may lead you down a certain path, like Yukiko and Yuki Onna. Originally, I had a part in the segment comparing the two, but halfway through my research, I realized there were just as many, if not way more blatant contradictions in comparing them that there were similarities. In fact, there were so many more, and the differences were far thematically awful to actually applying to the full interpretation of Yukiko, and so I scrapped it. Because even though on my surface level intuition, I said they might make sense, I had to level with myself that it wasn't additive to any logical point. This tangent might seem funnily placed, especially if you made it this far into the segments. It's easy to put your brain on autopilot and listen to someone talk for 2 hours and then have them call it analysis. Just listen and not think too much. But analysis isn't just recapping the story with some half-baked opinions for 2 hours, it's substantial, well, analysis. Okay, thanks for listening. Going back to Funny Man Adachi. Adachi ends the link mentioning how the old woman has tracked down a bunch of potential women in the area who might want to go on dates with Adachi, so he asks if he can crash and nap to avoid going home and seeing her. This is just another piece that shows even when there are other people in Adachi's life actively trying to help him with things that he wants and needs, the circumstances aren't good enough for him. He doesn't take the opportunity or the initiative offered to him, because it's easier to never try and believe in your potential than to give it your all and fail. Or at least, that's the lie that he's bought into. Rank 6 is the final link spent before Adachi's link becomes automatic through the Nanako arc and beyond. This link starts with Adachi slacking off and then worrying about the old woman spotting him when it turns out that her son Tohru is back visiting her. When she introduced her son to Adachi, she calls him that, the detective Adachi-san, instead of Tohru, as she has in previous links. You can imagine this as an intentional attempt to make Adachi feel like a temporary fix for her loneliness, a replacement. With her son back, Adachi is no longer any priority or help to feed. Tohru, the son, mentions that the old woman has mentioned the nice things that Adachi has done, spending time with his mom, and after the conversation, tells his mother what Adachi normally tells you, that the old woman might be getting in the way or being a nuisance, and that they should get on with their day. They even call back to the nimono, being Tohru's favorite food, and liking the renkon tough, things Adachi has complained about, but reinforcing his place as a superficial, if not less meaningful, replacement. Adachi predictably says he's glad that he doesn't have to be bothered by the old woman anymore. He starts insisting that he likes being alone. He likes the freedom of doing what he wants. Adachi mentions how his own mother always made the renkon tough too, how he never ate it, never liked it, but how his mother never acknowledged it or asked if he wanted it different. This could feed into what we already know about Adachi's home life growing up. It seems his parents didn't care a lot about what he liked or disliked. They didn't look after his safety or worry where he was. As long as he got good grades, they could care less. It seems like he grew up in an environment of neglect. Then Dojima retrieves Adachi. And that's it. Adachi plays a very important role in your information on and off regarding Nanako and her arc. He's the one who calls the investigation team and lets them know about her condition, the one who tells them to hurry to get there before her brief passing. Adachi is the one who lets your crew leave after Dojima detains you for the night, and he also fumbles around and acts like someone who is doubtful but supportive of you and the team. Adachi takes a lot of yelling and passion from the team, but doesn't retaliate with much, until you start seeing him acting rash or irresponsibly. Not keeping an eye on Dojima, putting Namatame in the same ward, letting Dojima know where Namatame is held, not reporting the letter to the police for analysis as he was instructed to do. He's getting sloppy, and it makes sense. For the course of the game, Adachi did two things under no suspicion with no trace of evidence. From there, he just watched the game play out. Now that he's finally involved more directly and had his ego take the reins on him, handwriting the letter, he's finally having to put some work in. He slips up immediately by defaulting to vaguely supporting the team, but being more supportive of false information. He accidentally leaks affirmation for the information that he was in no way to be able to be privy to. And that is his undoing, as Naoto catches on to it, and after being questioned and failing to convince everyone, he flees into the TV. After Nanako's hospitalization, the merge of the conscious and subconscious begins, with the fog moving into the town of Inaba, attempting to merge. This is being caused by Ame no Sagiri, Heaven's First Fog, the dwarf and the grandchild of Izanami that exists within Adachi. This is because Adachi's ideals align with the dwarf, but the dwarf is an aspect of Izanami and does not possess an ego. It is unable to enter the real world without a host to attach itself onto. So Adachi acts on behalf with the same ideals in the main world. This limitation isn't permanent though. It's this very limitation Ame no Sagiri plans to end. The reason Adachi feels this way is elaborated on later, as we'll get into. After discovering the fog may be leaking from the TV, the investigation crew find their way to the original place that was assumed to have been linked to Mayumi Yamano, but now we see is Adachi's bedroom. His obsession with Namatame, the Inca ballad singer, and Mayumi Yamano's new path off of it, but when the crew arrives, a fake Adachi is there waiting to greet them. There's been some confusion to how Adachi makes a seemingly spectral version of himself who is able to teleport and move inhuman while also stated to be far into Magatsu Inaba. But with the information I've given, I hope it's easy to clear up. Ame no Sagiri is a dwarf without an ego, a shadow. Shadows are archetypal forms of gods, folklore, and mythology as described by Jung, the players in stories. The great archetype, Ame no Sagiri, existed long before Adachi, but now exists as a part of Adachi. Adachi is the modern incarnation, the modern form of the idea and archetype that Ame no Sagiri represents. Due to Izanami awakening Adachi to his powers, at the current, Ame no Sagiri operates as an extension of Adachi as a way of limited existence in exchange for crossing into reality. But the being still being separate just takes on Adachi's form and ideals. This essentially makes it so there's like two Adachis. His shadow isn't just a distorted version of his ego mixed in with the impressions and perspectives of others, as well as the archetype, like the shadows of our party members. It is also its own thing, being placed onto him by Izanami, and is part of her total being as well, being a mythological grandchild of her. That's why Amino Sagiri fails to take form until we've defeated Adachi, because the compromise to crossing into the real world is to be attached to the ego, destroy the ego, and the shadow presents itself alone. Here we find out Adachi's reasoning and get similar cutscene flashbacks to the ones that we got of Namatame, except this time, obviously, the act is quite the opposite. The first murder of Mayumi Yamano we find was unplanned. He didn't know that people could even go inside the TV entirely, but his intent was to intimidate and make her fear for her life. The next murder was entirely intentional though, now that he's discovered what he could do with Mayumi Yamano without leaving a trace, as just a couple days after knowing, he made the next action. I know it's fairly morbid, but I think it's important to have a more clear reference for Adachi's actions as it illuminates much more clearly the fault in his logic here, even though intuitively many people will obviously see the issue anyways. Something he says when killing Saki Konishi is that,
God, these high school girls today. This world's gone straight to shit. When I was in school, I wasn't allowed to do anything but study my ass off. I was supposed to be the best of the best, and instead they stick me in the boonies.
You might notice here that Adachi says something that's somewhat contradictory to his own link on the surface. He states that he wasn't even allowed to do anything but study, when we know that he could do whatever he wanted as long as he studied. Two distinct ways of growing up, and remember, Adachi doesn't have any real insight to Saki Konishi's studiousness either. There's a number of ways to interpret this difference that would follow the Occam's razor approach. He could have been spiteful and in justifying his actions conflated his neglect of doing things outside of studying with the lack of things being allowed. One could also interpret Adachi lied to you in his link, but I don't think that it's necessarily that straightforward either, since he was never bragging about his freedom to do things, rather it was a way of softening the blow of neglect, and that neglect was reinforced by his connection to the tough daikon, which is too innocuous for Adachi to have intentionally built a hyperspecific narrative around for him to have had any reason to believe that you would observe and buy into it as an unassuming conversation. Most likely, I think this points to something that's a big theme with Adachi's character, as we'll see. That is, bad people exist. Sometimes bad people do bad things. Sometimes, for one reason or another, people get inflated sense of grandeur, assume that they deserve to be handed more than others, and act out when the world doesn't act how they deem proper. Sometimes bad people do bad things. Adachi is not a reliable narrator, and so we can't actually glean things about his true nature or life from him. Being dependent on him for the information passes the data through a heavy filter. We can still make out roughly who he is, but we have to be skeptical and not put our foot down for certain. This goes into also building Adachi as the everyman, a person disillusioned with the world, feeling fed up and jaded by society. Someone who has let the pressing down cynicism of everyday life make him a cold and bitter person. A person who doesn't recognize or thinks himself better than any help that comes his way. There's still that passing kernel of kindness though, but at this point it's kind of buried, and the only absolute truth to be ascertained is in his ferocious acts and the consequences of and for them. So let's hear his perspective on his own actions. Well, honestly, it's a pretty weak series of arguments. The first is that Mayumi and Saki were gold-digging on Namatame because they knew that one day he would rise in office as a successful and powerful man. There's so many things wrong that it's hard to even dissect with any level of importance without wasting your time. So I'll leave the response to Yosuke.
Shut the hell up!
His next argument comes at and before his boss fight, so we'll address them there. For where we are currently in the story, after learning how Adachi manipulated Namatame and Kubo, he gloats a bit about how this has just been some sadistic game to him. But most important, to ascertain, I think, he says you need a little excitement in your life, don't you? This is mirrored in his constant boredom and spite being sent to the boonies. In a way, like covered earlier, he felt that life had given him a hand devoid of prospects and excitement, and so he decided to lash out and create the excitement himself, even if it hurt others and ruined people's lives. People who had no real connection to him. He could find a distorted way to link them, whether it be some delusion of being rejected by the inhabitants that make up Inaba, that they were Inaba itself. Whatever he needed, coming up with solid reasoning seems to have never really been the priority to him, just appealing to his emotive intuitions. Just like the rest of Adachi's social link, the next sequence is new to Golden. You decide as a group not to come alone, but are given the option to anyway. It's meant as a last-ditch effort attempt to try and bring Adachi around on his actions and appeal to the relationship that you've built over his link thus far. When you come alone, though, even Adachi tells you you've made a mistake, that you should have everyone here, work together, win with friendship, and beat the bad guy. He's mocking the idea that having friends makes you stronger, while still believing that you should play by that game, and that's because of a few things. 1. Adachi has always been alone. He doesn't know how to truly be open with others, but his isolation has led him away. This puts a dichotomy between the way that you both have chosen to live your lives, and an opportunity to see which path was right. Also, 2, the idea of developing relationships to better build yourself a network and live a fuller life is the sort of message pushed onto people by society. It is an aspect of the culture that he believes lied to him, and is another piece of the lie, another jaded falsehood that he gets the opportunity to stomp out. So he can prove to himself that the world is wrong, and his perspective itself is righteous. Adachi wants you to face him. He wants the unfair many versus one, because as it is meta to pushing the game's positive message, Adachi believes his victory would do the same in proving his actions, that they made sense and were justified. 3. Amino Sagiri also knows his role given by Izanami, even if you don't. Like Philemon and Nyarlathotep, you both represent the hope and cynicism of humanity, the ability to rise and the inevitable falls. Which is more powerful? Which is more worthy? What represents humanity on a purer level? This is the very test that Izanami had planned to see play out when she gave the 3 perspectives to Namatame, Adachi, and Yu. You could say Yu is hope, while Adachi is despair, or in the theme of truth, that the player is the uncompromised search of the truth, the object truth outside of the faulty subject. The Namatame is the intent of good, the intent of truth, but is acted on an assumed truth, one that is not truly interrogated. And that Adachi is the truth of the subject, with no regard to the object. That Adachi is the self-created truth, without care for how it aligns or fails to align with the object world. 3 interpretations, and 1 to go the farthest, to carve the path for the future and the world, and for the values of humanity. Which are strongest? Logically, it makes sense that you would go farther, since taking the great effort to understand the world around you and what is in your control and out of your control is taking great effort to traverse it. Of course, with that mindset, you will get the farthest. While Adachi's mindset may still be able to accomplish some things, his mentality that actively avoids trying to understand the world and gain more knowledge, and instead makes convenient reasons that help his pre-established worldview and ideals, it's not hard to see that eventually a house built on sand will sink into the earth, or be washed away. And that's why Adachi is a dangerous tale of the cynical everyman. Because any person can have core beliefs, philosophies, political perspectives, religious ideas that conflict with reality. They convince themselves their perspective doesn't contradict the full data, or they assume a supersession of data. They close themselves to their contradictions, and the scariest thing is that due to baseline efficiency, every person does this with something, at least sometimes. That's why it's best to actively seek the truth, not become comfortable, but we'll get back to that in its proper part. Something Adachi says in this link is that it's the player's fault for trusting him, that your trust in others was your own fault that he betrayed you. Philosophically, this is pretty underhanded yet pretty obvious, and people could debate how thoroughly Adachi himself had thought his own line through, but let's really explore what the mentality implies. There's a lack of balance there. His mindset is essentially mixing 2 opposing philosophical perspectives. On one hand, he believes the personal responsibility to the extreme, that with every action you take, you are fundamentally responsible for what comes back to you. But while there's a kernel of truth there, it lies almost entirely in technicality. You measured the risk of negotiating and trying to turn him around. Now his decisions are what's actively hurting you there. Your decision to interact with him doesn't resolve his decisions to interact with you and how he chooses to behave. especially when Adachi actively hides how he truly is. Since he is statistically an anomaly, it's hard to find judgment when someone mistakenly trusts someone who wants to abuse it. After all, you have basically 18 other people who turned out the opposite way in the game. You also can't operate in a society without other people. Unless under hyper-specific circumstances, that part of a person's life is barely even a choice in a general sense. I mean, does Adachi propose that everyone live like him? Even the way he lives, isolated, relies on countless other people, interactions, and relationships to improve his life. Would he take it lying down if one time you made him dinner but decided to kill him whenever he was over? I imagine he would curse you out and not just accept it. If for nothing else, this perspective of Adachi's is wholly unfeasible to act out in reality, and part of that proof is Adachi himself being a hypocrite to the logical end of those beliefs. Conversation breaks down, literally, as his Jester link shatters and turns into the hunger. Let's address that now rather than later. The Jester and the Hunger are not normal archetypal figures, at least not within the arcana of the tarot. They may appear in some scuff unique tarot deck somewhere, but they are not real arcana. The Jester, however, is just another way of saying and mirroring the Fool. The Fool is the only person who is allowed to joke in front of the king, to bring up and push forward powerful truths that change and challenge society and power. It is because of the Jester's jokes that the problems of people can be voiced without punishment, which can make the Joker more versatile than other cards. The Joker, also called the Jester, is represented by the Fool arcana, which the player possesses. I think while the Fool represents the Jester archetype, it acts more than in jokes. It instead is the ability to freely move and search for truth. Adachi, on the other hand, never represented that. He was given the power to voice his grievances, but not the power to represent or move through the perspectives of others. In other words, he is a mirror of your arcana, but weaker in power due to his own life's choices. So here, his card turns into Hunger, but more accurately, the Hunger is meant to represent desire. The Japanese is yokubao, which, according to the English-Japanese dictionary Jisho, refers to appetite, lust, and desire. It's as if previously Adachi was merely voicing his concerns to the world, but now after revealing himself, has come to show his limitless action on that voice. The most generally applying word, desire, is attached on the Japanese wiki to the Strength tarot card, since the lower polarity of Strength is often rampant desire, while the card Strength itself shows the dance between a woman and the lion, the taming of the desire, and the ability to let it move freely. So, with this change, Adachi has essentially become the lion, or let the lion rule him entirely. He takes no responsibility, acts how he wants, is filled with lust, filled with hate, lacks discipline, lacks willingness to understand the world, and a desire. He is the untamed desire of lust and hunger. You get a touch of spite from Adachi about your youthfulness that will be doubled back around to in the confrontation later on, but otherwise, that is the hunger link. As a side note, Yosuke shows up after you leave and agrees not to tell the others. I think he understands. Honestly, this is one of the best Yosuke moments in my opinion. It shows some real depth to his character. But this isn't a segment on Yosuke, so I'll just play it with the context of things that I already set up way long ago in my Yosuke segment. When you enter Magatsu Inaba, Adachi's dungeon, he goes on and on about how you'll regret wasting your time on this case. How, shouldn't you good kids just go back in and study? Get a job at some good company? Marry a cute girl? Why are you all wasting your time with this? And it mirrors in a sort of meta and in-world way. He mocks the idea of being friends and taking over the bad guy again, mocking it as a childish idea, something people in the real world also mock when describing some JRPGs as, ooh, power of friendship to kill God. But those ideals are instilled in children because of how important it is to carry them through your life, and how they are a natural and proven method of success. That through challenge and hardship and strife, everyone has weakness. But if there's people to help cover for those weaknesses, more people can survive. Having a solid social network of people to back you up and rely on makes you much stronger than being alone. While it's not as cool, it's actually far more mature than one-handedly defeating God, which is a far more shallow power fantasy than the other, if the criticism is purely out of which is more childish. His other point is really to the youth, though. He mentions how his stomach starts hurting, how them pursuing things they want, not laid out by society, is a waste, right? Because he views things in a binary. Either you reject the system, or you get fed from it wholesale. Either you slack off and do what you want, or you believe the lie of good schooling, good company, good job, good family, die. That simply doesn't come the way of countless people who seek it that way. It didn't work out for Adachi after all, so he has spite for anyone who he sees as upholding part of that system. It's not a binary, though. Life is your own path to carve. It is precisely because the system doesn't always work that you have to be on your toes and work your best to actively continue navigating the best course for you, to actively seek the truth, rather than just assume and accept it how it's presented without any individual scrutiny or without rejecting it entirely. That's how you get to the best places in life, by understanding. Magatsu Inaba is a really good contrast to the later coming Hollow Forest that I think emphasizes the aspect of life that Adachi sees. Rather than a field of memories with specific buildings, rooms, areas replicated, the only part of Inaba represented are the cracked roads, the oppressive signage, signs of danger, of bike lanes, cracked roads, parking signs. They're all rules that you have to follow by, and they're all falling apart, aged, inaccurate, insufficient. They are joyless things commanding you around with none of the happy areas that they would normally be attached to. The buildings of Inaba are black, appearing and disappearing in vague silhouettes in the background. To Adachi, they are all a fog, a backdrop. He doesn't feel attached to any of it, like it just sits looming, mocking him and his powerlessness to end up here. Initially, you can't cut the danger tape, and so you have to leave the initial level of Magatsu Inaba by jumping down the rabbit hole. Magatsu, by the way, has a sort of unclear and hard-to-translate meaning, although many fans consider it to mean calamity or distortion in Persona 4. In reality, that isn't totally wrong, but to give it more context, Magatsu is made of the character Wagiwai, or Maga, alone. Wagiwai refers to calamity, catastrophe, and misfortune, while the reading of Maga refers to wickedness, evil, calamity, and disaster. Both meanings overlap somewhat, and both fit this context. The second character, Tsu, is much more varied, as the kanji for itself means a harbor, a port, a ferry boat, but when used in conjunction with itself, makes shinshin, referring to gushing, overflowing, everlasting, unfailing, and endless. Its kanji is also present in the word tsunami, as a key reading since tsunami has two spellings in Japanese. So the use of Magatsu here, I think, is best represented by the idea of a great storm, a breaking open of the barrels, a great gushing and powerful overflow of distortion and disaster. A great, unending outflow of evil, which again makes sense with the destroying, warning, and oppressive labels of the previous world destroyed and making up this level. As if to say, this disaster will, and was always, the conventions of the past world, and this is how it gives reign to new. It's also likely an allusion to Magatsuhi, a son of Izanagi, slain in the Kojiki before Izanagi stepped foot into Yomotsu Hirasaka to search for Izanami. But for broader story mythology and lore, we already covered that at the start of this video. After jumping in the hole, you come to the most of the dungeon, Magatsu Mandala, and so let's get into what mandala likely is in this context. Mandala means circle in Sanskrit. It's a Buddhist symbolic picture of the universe. There are usually 3 types of mandala, with one being made of sand, prayed over, and then destroyed, giving the underlying message that nothing is permanent. It is said that Adachi has full control over Magatsu Mandala, but not Magatsu Inaba. Meaning this, I think. The interior world, as Adachi understands it, the world he tried to create, is limited by his understanding of the reality that he lives in. And so instead he turns to the mandala to formulate his ideas, and once they are realized, he can act them out on the real world. The idea of creating and destroying, and nothing being permanent, also makes sense in a few obvious ways with Adachi's attempt to fuse the shadow world and the real world by overtaking and destroying it with shadows and fog. He was born into one reality and ruminated and focused on the mandala of his reality. And now, he seeks to bring his prayers to fruition, destroying the current way of the world and creating a new through shadows. The first conversation with Adachi and Magatsu Mandala is about justice, and questions if they aren't just doing all this to gain a little spice in their lives. This actually resonates a lot with some of what we know of our character arcs. We know through social links, each of them used this murder case at some point as a reason outside of the case itself. Yosuke used it to be special and feel important, like his life mattered. Chie used it as a guise of justice to live further in her chunibyo. Yukiko used it to gain a sense of direction and power from a restricted life. Kanji used it to search for his answer in What is a Man? Rise used it to fulfill a sense of agency and direction once she left her literal agency. Naoto used it because she enjoys detective work and seeked to be approved by the Japanese police to work on it. They all sought to fix this, in part due to completely different reasons than justice. The thing is, though, all the things they did seek were still in search for a truth. Truth is justice. Truth allows for justice. There is nothing inherently unjust or immoral about having separate personal reasons for their search. It doesn't take away from their objective, and even if these things did serve them, it's not like those things would even exist if they didn't put a stop to this. So this is justice. He continues, what's the difference between that and a murderer who gets their kicks by murdering people? And while most people's reaction, I'm sure, will be that he's just crazy and that you shouldn't even take this sort of line seriously, he insists to give it some thought, though. And I take that as the writers telling the player not to dismiss this just as crazy villain speak. I think there's countless differences in those things, of course. You could go on endlessly, but I think the one that the game is pointing to is one of those actions limits truth, while the other one furthers it. Murdering someone not only limits the truth had about that person, but it limits the person from ever reaching a further truth themselves. Other people may find truth in the situation upon reflection, sure, but the act of murder itself still stifles the search for truth overall. It removes without permission the right of someone to think, to be alive, to make decisions and to understand their reality. The actions of the party all further their understanding of themselves, their place in life, their truths. The things aren't similar at all. In Magatsu Mandala 4, Adachi speaks up with something notable again. He asks why the truth is so worth seeking if everyone else doesn't even want it, if you're the only one satisfied by it. The thing is, though, and this is actually very similar to the third semester in Persona 5 thematically, and even the cult of Nyx in Persona 3, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. Reality is reality. And the only way to be satisfied in reality, barring magical powers, is an understanding of how it operates and an ability to efficiently obtain what you want within it due to this understanding. That's the purpose of the pursuit of knowledge and of understanding. If one day you wish to sink into the dirt and swim on the grass like it were a pool of water, no matter how much you would like that to be reality, no matter how much you want that to be true, it won't be. It doesn't matter how few people like it. Truth is truth. We are all born into an unfair world, but a world that can be mostly understood, and is continued to be more understood over the last thousands of years. Exponentially so. At least as far as things needed to efficiently navigate it are concerned, nothing gives one person the right to overpower the entire world, to change the systems of humanity to their will, and center it around their ideals. No person has that right. No god has that authority. The world we exist in may be riddled with hardships, but it's hardships sparked by the freedom of people to build their own worlds within ours, of people to broadly hold their own ideals even when things go awry. There has and likely will never be a time where the entire human world unflinchedly bends to one person. For that to succeed, you have to take the human out of humanity. You have to scrub out free will, or the perception of it, and the human ego. And that's exactly what Adachi is intending to do here. It is mentioned in Persona 4 that he plans on merging the shadow world with Inaba and turning all humans into shadows. That means the erasure of their ego. As things are now, psychologically speaking, humans contain an ego and a shadow. When that shadow is understood, it can be harnessed through self-actualization into a persona. A shadow contains no free action, though. It is merely a being of habit, an archetype, a storybook stereotype. It has no possibility for growth or for change. To turn humanity into shadows is to erase the ego. It's to erase the mind, free will, and the human in humanity. So, even if only a single person, even if nobody wants it, seeking the truth is always imperative. It's our only option, quite literally. To deny the truth is to give in to the loss of ego, to let go of what makes people human. Abandoning truth is to kill oneself. Mandala 5, Adachi states how society believes the quote-unquote truth of Namatame being a serial killer. And even if they catch Adachi, that truth will make the previous idea of truth proven false. He asks, what will happen then? And says that they will simply latch on to what they're told, this supposed new truth, the truth that they were told. Nothing about the world or human nature will change, just following orders, accepting what's given to them. He claims that it is the truth that the player seeks, that this is what we're actually fighting for. This is a false equivalency in the usage of the word truth. He is conflating our truth with what the public accepts. But in the previous segment, his very point was that people don't want truth at all, or our truth. He's essentially trying to break down our ideas from any angle that he can possibly approach it from. So in this way, I think we can see an implied similarity between what he claims of the public and what he seeks to do. He claims the public act en masse, and without taking time to understand truth. We see aspects of this in social links throughout the game. The way the cops stereotype Kanji, the way the other mothers ostracize Eddie, and the way that Eddie gives in to the television. The thing is, though, they always possess the potential to change and grow. Whether they do or do not is irrelevant. It should be considered person by person. The important thing is that they have the option, the chance, and the possibility. Adachi seeks a formatted forcing of the way that he claims that people already follow. Except now, they will unthinkingly operate as their archetype rather than unthinkingly follow the crowd. In this way, you can see how the two different ideas of Mandala and Mandala 4 may not be contradictory. He claims that people don't want the truth, so he seeks to take away the burden of being able to understand truth, the ability to seek it whatsoever. Each time in different ways, though, he shows that he doesn't understand the idea of truth at all, which makes sense from someone who has been actively denying it their whole life, and whose perspective is the representation of a denied object reality. In creating Mandala of their own personal universe rather than the real one, the boss of Mandala 3 is a shadow resembling a police officer called Chaotic Fuzz. Not hard to see the implication there. Mandala 6's boss, though, is much more fleshed out, and is also what you have to beat to break the mandala and progress through the rest of Magatsu Inaba. That is the Envious Giant, a shadow made to resemble the Tokyo Tower with HP and SP stats of 3,333, resembling the equally tall 333-meter height of Tokyo Tower. It's called Envious and represents a high tower in the center of Japan's largest metro. It's likely, pardon the intentional pun, the height of what Adachi wanted from his life. To be the center of attention, recognized, praised, big city, big respect. He's envious of the life that he feels he deserved for studying hard in school. Finally, though, you can return to Magatsu Inaba and face Adachi for real. One thing to notice immediately as you enter the final path is that Inaba is below the map. It appears that you are in the sky, far above Inaba, which makes sense as Ami no Sagiri is the first fog of heaven. There's some back and forth, but eventually we get better insight into why Adachi was sent to the boonies. He shot someone. He talks about how he joined the police force to legally carry a gun. He thought it would be so fun to have a gun, but according to him, the idea of fun was a wash because all the people around him were getting stupid and getting on his case for one tiny mistake after he got his. Considering everything we know about Adachi's idea of fun and his tendency to avoid responsibility, it's hard to reasonably interpret what he's saying any other way. Most of what Adachi says in his speech is a more organized culmination of the more detailed arguments he put forward prior, but this time he adds another aspect to his worldview to the conversation. That people who succeed in life just happen to be born with a magic ticket called talent. He says, if you don't have it, you can either accept it or deny that fact until you die. That's your only choice. I think a lot of people resonate with this idea. There's a lot of media, even specifically Japanese media, that covers the idea of hard work and talent from different angles, sometimes in more or less nuanced ways. From Danganronpa to Haikyuu, you can find the discussion all over the place. Adachi's argument here, though, despite leaning on the theoretical, cynical everyman woes that people often find themselves empathizing with, despite all that, the argument is quite bad and can be disassembled pretty easily. The easiest way to ask is, what is talent? If you don't get a hard definition, the word is essentially a filler for a vague concept that even the person arguing it doesn't understand. Let's say instead of a definition, they point to prodigies and successes that we see all around us as proof of talent. But say, if you're only able to define talent by pointing at successful people, and your issue is that successful people have talent, the word talent virtually loses its purpose. It becomes a logical fallacy, a circular argument where essentially it becomes successful people exist when you don't, you can accept or deny that until you die. But being successful isn't bad inherently. It's what we all want. It's what Adachi wants. His issue is the feeling that the world was unfair to him. The thing is, though, the world is too wide, and our personal knowledge is too limited to ever encapsulate and understand the total net gains and losses of anyone from the starting line. There are an infinite amount of hobbies, skills, things to get good at in the world. And even if you're born lacking in one thing or a few, there will always be something that you are more disposed to. But you won't know it unless you find it. And you won't know it until you understand that thing. Statistically speaking, there are countless extremely talented prodigies that have been failures that we can never know or understand. People who maybe even died in times or in situations where they never even discovered the thing that they were good at. Sometimes family situations set people back. Sometimes those same family situations drive people to massive success. There's no golden talent ticket that works as a save-all success token. If you put a golden wrench into the hands of one naturally gifted person and one average person, the gifted person will still fail if their personality disposition just happens to be lazier. But maybe that disposition itself could be considered as talent. Let's say the average person possessed curiosity for their task and finished it quicker and better. Is that curious mind a talent in and of itself? Is talent merely a scale of all collected positive and negative affecting aspects of our lives? What about traits that aren't inherently positive or negative, but operate with greater cohesion in combination with others? Point being, this idea is too big for you. It's too big for any modern computer to rationalize. It's too abstract for any equation to see it through, even if theoretically it might be possible. We will almost certainly never know if it's right, because the world is always changing and new ideas are always being discovered, new trends, inventions, and the internet would have been sci-fi 100 years ago. Thing is, we will never know that we don't have talent unless we convince ourselves early that we don't. Even if you work your whole life on something and never see success, it could theoretically mean you just didn't find that talent. Even looking at the wealthiest and most successful people, look at their children. Just as many ones that go on to be famous end up dying of drug overdoses or residing to a quiet existence off the teat of their parents' work. Are they luckier? Sure they are. In tons of ways. In astronomically unfair ways. It doesn't mean that you're not talented. The only thing that guarantees you are is buying into it. But let me not be too harsh. Just because it doesn't hold up in the slightest scrutiny doesn't mean the words don't resonate. That they don't even resonate with me. It doesn't mean Adachi's feelings are invalid either. He considered himself smart. He worked hard. He did what he was asked. And he feels like he's gotten nothing for it. All this time, Adachi has blamed others for his failure, but now he blames his own existence as a failure by design. That he wasn't constructed right, constructed good enough. He hates the idea that he could have tried so hard and failed. So the cope has to be some ethereal and other more definitely blessed people than him who condemned his failure. Ironically, because Adachi was blessed literally by a god, albeit a cognitive one, with the powers of the heavens or Ami no Sagiri and the link between realities. In fact, it's even due to his sour disposition that he was chosen for this task, considered in the parallels of the game that Izanami wanted to create. It's not that impossible to imagine a life where Adachi got friends, put away his urges, and embodied what the player you did. Then some other person with his disposition could have arrived and he could have been the hero of this story. Maybe the disposition of the younger Adachi was just like you. Chie mentions in her Ultimate Persona Link that she could have seen herself becoming jaded like Adachi if she hadn't actively tried to consider what that was and what she wanted growing up in her life. Adachi mentions how the investigation team are just kids and wouldn't understand because, yeah, life makes things hard. I'm just getting to the point where I look back at high school and despite loving my time there and having a lot of positive experiences, I wish I could do it better. I wish I could tell myself and prepare for how the world is, because in high school, reality felt outside of me. Like an unfinished outside landscape to a level perpetually trapped in a building. The windows giving ideas of what laid ahead, but with no intention to go outside. Adachi may be right about one thing, with the investigation team not understanding the real world and its pressures. But he's not right about their mentalities. His mentality may have been lurched in the do good, follow orders to find happiness perspective, the truth he claims that the masses clasp onto. But the investigation team's truth is held in something deeper, something truer. It's the actual truth. Sometimes it causes them to go left, and sometimes right. The compass inside of them is dictated by them, navigated, adjusted, re-equipped for new situations, and so, despite their current ignorance, their willingness to face the truth and navigate, it will always allow them to face what life throws at them with eloquence. In the battle, Adachi uses Magatsu Izanagi, a black and red distortion of the Fool, of the player's starting arcana. Many of the same interpretations of Magatsu can be retooled here, as this is also the part of Adachi's creation and inner self. It is also another length that the game goes to draw parallels between Adachi and the player. Adachi actually doesn't say much in this fight, which is somewhat surprising, allowing instead his distortion or desire to sort of overtake him. After the fight, he mentions how no matter what, the world will become shadows, sadly confirming that even in his acts of defiance, he was ultimately aware that his role was only a technicality in pushing through the ideas that he believed. Almost immediately after, Adachi's ego collapses and is overtaken by the attached dwarf of Ami no Sagiri. We don't see Adachi again until the end of the next fight. If you haven't already seen my thoughts on Ami no Sagiri and Ami no Kuni, please go check out my analysis of that. I will link it in the cards. After that defeat, Adachi tells the team, fine, they can live as they want. If they want to change the world, then go ahead. This calls back to him seeing it as a challenge of ideals. As much as he isn't happy with it, he sees that the possibility is finally real, that it supersedes his own potential. Adachi asks that they leave him, for some reason assuming that they would go and let him die there. And of course they don't do that. When you lean over for the next social link, is Adachi speculating on, despite seeming to have the same power, how they turned out so differently? From the game's answers, it's clear that it's wanting you to look at it a certain way. That you had friends, that you expanded your connections, and sought to understand people of all walks of life around you. It's not too late for Adachi to begin, though. Even if it doesn't erase or forgive his actions, just like everyone, and just like the power that you were fighting to preserve, he still has the capability to change. Before the final dungeon, Nanako gives you a letter from Adachi. He agrees after accepting defeat that he will live his life in the real world, and gives you a tip on finding the person behind it all. He seems to be changing, showing proof of that, or at least trying in some way. But like most characters, his final appearance is to help invigorate the player, to resist, survive, and defeat Izanami. Very in character, he says,
You make me take responsibility for my sins, but you're gonna let this take you down like this? That's hilarious. Get up. You're not like me, right?
He's taken responsibility. But again, if he's going to live by your ideals, he expects those ideals to come out on top when tested. Your beliefs are the truth, are they not? So that's Adachi, the true culprit, the murderer of Persona 4 Golden, the defective detective, the jaded, lonely denier of reality booted to the boonies. There's a lot to say about him, and still more. I'm surprised just how much I had to go into with this segment, but I hope that it was satisfying to you. Still, I'm not done. I'm going to go into some non-canon alternative endings involving Adachi now. So, if you're this far in, please comment and share the video, either on Reddit, Twitter, wherever you think people are active. This, as with all of the other parts of the series over the last year, has been an insane amount of work and huge investment. I'm hoping that I get some return on that, if you know what I mean. I do this because I love it. It would be torture otherwise, but if I ever want to do a series like this in the future, I'm going to need your support. So, if you want access to behind-the-scenes material and scripts, as well as screen caps and monthly Patreon talks, your support on Patreon, or if you prefer, PayPal on Twitch is super appreciated. Anyways, for this next part. When given the option to confront Adachi as the killer, Persona 4 Golden added another ending as an accomplice, where you can choose to keep Adachi's secret for him, leaving your friends in the dark even after you leave. As Naoto says, the truth will be forever lost in darkness. Teddy never comes back, Namatame remains guilty, the fog is never cleared, but curiously, it also never consumed the town entirely and killed everyone. I imagine this is because, since you sided with the ideals of Izanami, she is allowing you your time to leave. You decide to see Adachi and confront him, telling him you're on his side. Even Adachi is dumbfounded that you would do this, as it's basically a meme ending. Adachi's link remains as the Jester instead of turning into hunger, and you essentially get blackmailed into doing anything Adachi wants at risk of your own life or others. Although it's more of a vague threat than anything. Still, not a good spot to be in, considering how Kubo turned out. Honestly, I enjoyed this addition to the game, if for anything, then it being so dark and different from the other endings. It's debatably the worst ending, except you didn't fail. You did it on purpose, which is intriguing. Unfortunately, on a substantive level, there's not really much more to be extrapolated on about Adachi's character here than is already seen elsewhere through Mitsuo Kubo's dungeon, and there's far, far less to be extrapolated than the other routes that have you go into Magatsu Inaba. For me, the intrigue is about all it offers, with any interesting thoughts about it being left for mostly a part of creativity and conjecture. It feels like what it is, a tacked-on bonus ending, some extra content, but I feel it did less to actively add to the characterization than other moments added for Golden. The mini added band arc added more insight to the characters, and even the second hot spring scene did some to complete and tie up pieces of Naoto's character arc that went previously unattended to. And if the hot spring scenes are offering more characterization and insight, then yeah, I don't know, I'm still glad it was added. It adds a bit more dark flair to Persona 4 Golden's identity that I feel was overall lightened up with the new scenes and aesthetic compared to the original PS2 release. Balances things out, I guess. Tohru Adachi, one of the worst kept secrets in Persona. That was my back-to-back analysis of him, trying to mention every character detail and thread that I thought I could extrapolate any interesting information or meaningful intent out of. He's certainly more than meets the eye, and despite researching thoroughly, I had no idea his segment would be this long. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, turn on the bell, as I have already posted so many segments and will eventually be dropping the full analysis with over an hour of new content added in, everything in the proper order. It's the definitive way to watch this whole series. It'll be dropping soon. These projects take so much time. Please support me on Patreon. You guys are my lifeline. I'll see you soon.